Okay, hello everybody. I hope you're all having a lovely week. I thought that since we're coming into December now, and it's the end of the year, that I might take some time to talk about the best books that I've read this year. So these are just books that I've been reading throughout the year, and I think a lot of people have been feeling that obviously 2020 has been a very challenging year for many people in different ways. And I know, at least for myself, that reading for the first time in a really long time has been like a big helper for my mental health, and especially as like escapism. It's really helped me to kind of get through this time. And all that, I did 4 years of studying literature at uni, and I've always liked reading, I've always loved reading, but it hadn't quite functioned as necessarily reading for pleasure in the same way that it did this year. I think before, my relationship with reading had always been quite academic, and it's always been an enriching experience for me. It's always something that I've kind of got a lot out of, intellectually, emotionally, academically. But I think this past year in particular, it really has served a different function, which is comfort primarily. And as much as I also chose books to read this year that educated me on some of the things that have been happening this past year, it really comfort has been the biggest driver, I think, in terms of my reading this year. You know what? I'm going to take a quick break, 2 minutes into the video, to go get some alcohol, so bear with me. Oh, sorry about that, everybody. I just feel like, we're all just sitting back, having a chat, and, let's kick back and relax a little bit. I don't know when else we really take the time to try and kick back, so, I hope you'll join me in having a drink as you watch this. So, before we get into the 15 best books that I've read this year, I thought I might mention 2 books that I was really hesitant to take these off the list. These are 2 books that I read this year that really made a big impact on me when I read them. And definitely I want to read more of both authors' works. But I read a lot of really good books this year. I think I had a record turnout in terms of, how many books I was reading. I was pretty much reading a book a week, which might not seem like a lot to some, but for me was quite an accomplishment, because I have a lot of hobbies, and hobbies take time. So while I love reading, it wasn't necessarily something that I put over other hobbies. I love watching films, I love reading comics, I love drawing comics, as you well know from this channel and my business. But it was the first time in a long time I really kind of privileged reading over the others. So the first book that is one of our runner-ups is Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I kind of made an effort to read a bit more Russian literature this year than I have in the past, and I've always been intrigued and kind of enamoured by Dostoevsky. Just his status, and obviously kind of he's famous for his works having quite like a dark richness and kind of really plumbing the depths of humanity in a way that other writers don't. And I think I bought this in a bookshop in York several years ago, and it was the artwork on the cover that really spoke to me, and thought, I think it's time to read some Dostoevsky. So this book has both Notes from Underground and The Double in it. And I when I was reading this, Notes from Underground really shocked and provoked me. It's such an incredible novel. Difficult to get into at first, because the first half of it is basically a philosophical tract, and the second half of it is the story of this character, and kind of, I don't know if it would count quite as existentialism, but this is surely an influence on existential writers later on. And just the way that he sees the world, and the way that he kind of relates to other people, or fails to relate to other people, was really interesting to me. I had a go at the double, and I must admit that while Notes from Underground was compulsively readable, I couldn't put it down, the double was the exact opposite, and I didn't actually finish it. So, you know, maybe skip on the double, but make sure to check out Notes from Underground. It was a really, really good book. And then the second runner-up for me, for the 15 best books, is Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut, which... I don't know why I kind of avoided reading this for so long. I think it felt like almost every person my age had either read this book or was, you know, had some sort of relationship with it, and I think that sort of put me off reading it for a short while. But I finally read it this year in this lovely kind of hardcover edition, which has a lot of extras in the back, and yeah, it's a really good book. It starts off, you think it's going to be a kind of a very surreal comedy, but it quickly devolves into this brilliant examination of PTSD and trauma and kind of the non-linear timescale, you know, relating the main character's kind of fractured state of mind around the firebombing of Dresden, which by the time, you know, you might be laughing as you're going through this book, but by the time you get to those final 20 pages, this book grips you in a way that you feel like you're seeing something that you shouldn't be seeing. A real failure of humanity, you know, encapsulated at the end of this book. Yeah, I feel like I need to sit on this a bit more to see how I think about it later on. I might reread it. I definitely want to read some other Kurt Vonnegut books because I really liked his writing style. But yeah, top read. If you haven't checked this out, I highly recommend it. Okay, so with those two books talked about, I think it's time to get into my 15 best books that I read this year. These aren't ranked in any order. I couldn't possibly rank them because I loved all of these books so much. But the only order that I'm presenting them in is the order that I read them. So we're going from the book I read earliest in the year to the book I read most recently. I think you'll find we've got a really good... I'm actually really happy with the kind of variety of books that I've read this year. So without further ado, let's get into it. This is a book that anybody who knows me, I've been absolutely fucking obsessed with this book over the past year. I've bought it for so many people, and I would not hesitate to put this firmly in the company of the 10 best books I've ever read in my life. It just absolutely weaved a spell on me, and I continue a year later to keep thinking about this story and keep going back to it. And I'm of course talking about True Grit by Charles Portis, which I have here in this beautiful illustrated Folio Society edition, illustrated by Juan Esteban Rodriguez, and his illustrations for this book completely just wrapped me up in the story. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful version of the book. If you've only ever seen the John Wayne film or even the Coen Brothers film, I'd say don't hesitate to read this. It's better than both films. It's probably the best Western I've read. I've read a few Westerns, but I've not read some of the classics like Lonesome Dove yet and Riders of the Purple Sage, maybe next year. But this far and above really just took my breath away. And the story basically follows a 14-year-old girl called Mattie Ross, pictured on the cover, whose father is shot dead and robbed by a criminal called Cheney. And Cheney flees into Indian territory, and Mattie Ross is a very perceptive narrator, and a lot of the humour in the book is from like how she kind of perceives the world and the way that she thinks, and her intellect is so sharp, and it leads to a lot of people kind of underestimating her. And she knows that she's intelligent, and she knows that she can go and do these things. But a lot of the tension in the book comes from her relationship with Rooster Cogburn, who is the marshal that she pays to track down Cheney. And, you know, as much as many of the characters underestimate her, she also underestimates how tough the journey she's about to undertake is. And while the book is full of humour, it's also full of its big share of tragedy. And it's really like, it feels like the perfect kind of Western that kind of fits in the chain between something like the classic Westerns of like the Virginian and the John Wayne kind of era, and the more modern, kind of postmodern Westerns of someone like Cormac McCarthy and the Coen brothers. And it's no surprise to me that the Coen brothers made a film of this, because the book so follows their kind of trademark sense of humour. So if you are looking for a short, fantastic read that I guarantee is going to entertain you and take you out of the spot that you might be in, and you need some escapism, read this book and then watch the Coen brothers film. Maybe watch the John Wayne film, but the Coen brothers did a better job of adapting this, in my opinion. So, our next read, which took me a very long time to read. I actually started reading it last year, but I only finished it this year, is finally having read J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, as illustrated by Alan Lee, who I had the pleasure of meeting several years ago and inscribed this copy to me. Alan Lee is a big hero of mine, primarily because of his illustrations in this book, which I was first introduced to when I visited my aunt when I was about 5, and I saw her copies of these, her 3 copies of The Lord of the Rings with his illustrations in, and I didn't know what Lord of the Rings was, I didn't know who Tolkien was, but I fell into this world for 3 hours as I flipped through the illustrations. I tried reading it when I was younger, but I found it very difficult, I must admit. I was probably about 9 when I tried to read these books, and you know, Fellowship of the Ring is a great book, but it's really, those first 150 pages are quite difficult to get through. There's a lot of information and a lot of setup, but once you get into this book, I couldn't put it down. I was absolutely transported. I mean, it's almost, I kind of feel like I've got nothing to say about this book, because this book is so well known and so read and so loved as well, and I felt that love reading this book, particularly Return of the King. You know, I think a lot of people see the Return of the King as the weakest of the 3 film versions, but it's absolutely the strongest of the three parts of Lord of the Rings. It's absolutely phenomenal, and the despair and the tragedy and the hope that is in that book, Peter Jackson somewhat captures, but he doesn't quite capture the emotional. Each page is just one hit after another with that book, and I was literally sobbing reading the last 10 pages of this in a way that I sometimes do with the films, but this book reached inside me, and really affected me. And I think a big part of that is, you know, as I was reading this, I could see, and I felt like I was learning a part about my mum and my aunt when they read this when they were kids. And I felt like I was learning something new about them, about people that have had a big impact on me, and I love very dearly. So yeah, this was a very special experience for me. I imagine a lot of you will have read this, but if you haven't, give it a go, because it's fucking worth it. It's, yeah. I love this book. Okay, our next book, we're changing things up. We're leaving the genre fiction behind and going with some non-fiction. This book was bought for me in 2009 by an English teacher of mine, Mr. Andre Tyson. And he bought it for me after I won a prize or something at the school that I was at the time in New York. And, you know, he bought this for me. I think it's one of his favourite books, and it is Into the Wild by John Krakauer. If you've only seen the Sean Penn film, read the book. It's about a man called Chris McCandless. I think when he was 22, he got rid of all of his earthly possessions, basically, and decided to live on the road, and went travelling around America. And his final trip was to Alaska, and this isn't a spoiler, it's even on the front cover of the book, but he ended up dying in the wilderness in Alaska, and it was John Krakauer was the reporter for a certain magazine at the time who wrote a profile on Chris McCandless, and he became obsessed with this story, and decided that there was more to discover. And the book is a really interesting exploration of somebody who a lot of people said was incredibly irresponsible and lived way too dangerously. But there's more to the story than that. And John Krakauer, in his limited point of view as an outsider to the story, as an outsider to the McCandless family, goes through several routes where he tries to explain who he thinks Chris McCandless was and what Chris McCandless means to him. I've since found out there's another book written by Chris McCandless's sister, which brings to light some new information about Chris McCandless that wasn't available to Krakauer at the time, and more definitively shows who Chris McCandless was and why he did what he did, which I won't say what that is here. But the thing is, even knowing that parts of this book are discredited, I guess, by that later book, the prose and the writing of John Krakauer is so strong that I still highly recommend reading this first. And then if you want to have a clearer picture of Chris McCandless and find out the truth behind the tragedy, read his sister's book. But start with this one, because this is a phenomenal piece of writing. And you might it might inspire you to live your life a little bit differently. It certainly made me a little bit more wary of my relationship with material things. He says as he records a video of the 15 best books he read this year. So yeah, check it out. We're continuing with a non-fiction yet again for our next book. Again, this is somebody who I think a lot of people who know me will know of my love for this artist. I'm talking about Sing Backwards and Weep, the first book and memoir first memoir by Mark Lanegan, who, if you don't know Mark Lanegan, you may be aware of his work in the 90s grunge band Screaming Trees. He was the vocalist for Screaming Trees, and this memoir follows kind of him from his childhood through the kind of heights of the Screaming Trees, the recording of his first 2 solo albums, and then the disintegration of the Screaming Trees. It really goes beyond that though, and it's not so much a rock autobiography. I feel like we get a dime a dozen for rock autobiographies, and not all of them are very good. But this really, Mark Lanegan doesn't hold anything back in his portrayal of himself, and he's incredibly honest, perhaps way too honest, with the reader about the kind of man that he was and the kind of things that he did. And he really plumbs the depths of why he was the way he was during that time. He was a drug addict at the time, and eventually a drug dealer as well, and eventually homeless. And seeing him fall apart in that way was very hard to read, because his music has meant so much to me, and continues to mean so much to me, especially in the light of this book, because there's obviously a darkness in his music, and this book shows you the darkness. It really affected me, and the last 70 pages of this is probably the toughest thing I've read all year in terms of the depravity and the just what he does to himself. It's just unconscionable and unthinkable. And again, I've said this once already, but I felt like I was reading something that I shouldn't. But I think it's really important as well, and really brave of him to talk about this time in his life. And I think a lot of people who struggle with addiction might read this book and be inspired by him, because, you know, for all intents and purposes, for all the things that he did to himself, he should be dead. And the fact that he isn't is a testament to his character and to the strength of his character. So yeah, it's going to change. It might change how you view the artist. I won't lie. I know my dad read it, and he certainly feels a bit more reluctant to idolize Lanegan as an artist. But you know, maybe that says more about how we view artists rather than than listening to who they tell us that they are. But yeah, I cannot recommend this enough. I was really affected by this read. So yeah, there's a lot of truth in here. And speaking of truth, this is probably perhaps the most important book I read this year. In the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests around the world, I felt the need to educate myself about the issues of systemic racism and police brutality, and come to understand the systems of the state and how they oppress people of colour. And in terms of understanding that in a British context, in the country that I live in, this was the most essential book that I read this year. I'm of course talking about Natives, Race and Class in the Ruin of Empire by Akala. If you don't know Akala, Akala is a London-based rapper and probably now more famous as a writer and as a guest on several panel shows where he discusses racism and race in the United Kingdom. And I think the reason why this book was so important to me was that it didn't just explain how things are, it explained why they are. And you really come to understand through reading this book how, you know, we often look at the empire in the UK as this great kind of project that modernised the world. I never saw it myself. I was educated in several countries that were colonised by the UK, so I never kind of had that myth taught to me. But in the UK, in the media, in the newspapers, in schools even, the empire is taught as this kind of great modernising project, and that is just not the truth. You know, Britain might have been modernised, but the rest of the world was enslaved and brutalised to make that happen. And I think the great thing about this book is that Akala really clearly illustrates how the Britain of the 1800s and the 1900s relates to the Britain of today, and how even though the empire has not been a thing for, you know, 100 and something years now, the practices of empire and the brutality of empire continues to shape the way that we think about race in the United Kingdom and the way that the systems think about race. So if you are a person in Britain today who wants to learn more about how race affects the day-to-day life of people in this country, this is the book that you need to read. On top of that, it's just compulsively readable because Akala has, as academic as the book is, Akala has a really brilliant writing style, and I couldn't put it down. I think I read it in 4 days. I was absolutely swallowed up by this book. So, yeah, recommended. Okay, we're going back to some genre fiction right now. This is another classic that, again, I think a lot of people my age have read, and I hadn't really skipped out. Not that I'd skipped out on it, but I've actually owned this copy of this book for about 10 years now, and it took me until this year to read it. I'm of course talking about Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, which I have here in a American paperback with the Blade Runner artwork on the front. And the artwork is actually what made me buy the book when I did, because I love Drew Struzan's poster for Blade Runner, and I thought, you know, this is one of those books that I don't mind having a film cover on because the artwork is so beautiful and the film is so iconic as well. I'd seen Blade Runner many times. I think as a teenager, I didn't particularly like it, but I appreciated it. But there was always something about that film that kept me going back to it. And I've rewatched it so many times trying to figure out what this movie is. And it's only really in the last year and a half that I love the film. And I love the sequel, Blade Runner 2049, just as much. The world that it conjures is so rich and beautiful and sad. And the book has that darkness too. I'd actually say it's a darker book than the film. It's more entrenched in kind of the film noir genre than I think the film was. The film kind of plays with it, but does different things with this. with it. This reads like a Philip Marlowe book. This reads like a Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain, 1940s crime noir story that happens to be set in the future with androids. Yeah, again, this is a book that was surprisingly quite easy to read. Like, Philip K. Dick has really approachable prose that makes his books really entertaining to read. And yeah, this was the first Philip K. Dick book. I definitely want to read more. I've got a Scanner Darkly downstairs to read. Yeah, if you've been sleeping on this, definitely worth a read. It continues to live on in my mind after I've read it. I think when I finished it, I was like, that was very good. But something about this book, just like the film, continues to stick with me. And I find myself thinking back to it quite often. I think it really hit a nerve yet, and I think this is something I'll reread in the coming months. To again, just like the film, try and figure out what makes this book so mystical and brilliant. Yeah. Okay, moving on to our next book. This is one that I hadn't really intended on reading. I'd seen it in Waterstones many, many times, and I think, I don't know, part of me, when I see a book so relentlessly pushed by Waterstones, I kind of turn myself off from it. I don't really want to engage. But, you know, this year I made an effort to read more books by writers of colour. And especially in the wake of these Black Lives Matter protests. And I remembered this book being so pushed by Waterstones, and I thought I should give this a read. I'm talking about Half of a Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And the book follows the story of about 5 characters in Nigeria who, you know, during the civil war in Nigeria. Yeah, it's... I don't quite know how to describe it, because it's an epic novel. It might look like a short book, but you know, we're talking, this version is 433 pages, and with very tiny font. I think any other publisher would have put this about 600 or 700 pages. But yeah, you don't really need to know anything about Nigeria or Biafra before going into the book. The book is very, it kind of explains what you need to know as you go along. So for those who might be a bit wary about reading a book that's so entrenched in a culture that you might not be familiar with, the book does a lot of the heavy lifting for you, so please don't feel afraid to read the book. I think what remains with me about the book is the characters. Chimamanda has such a talent for putting you in the minds and the presence of these characters, and feeling like, you know, they're family to you. You know these people, you know their struggles, and seeing them go through what they do go through is a hard read at points. There's a lot of suffering in this book, but you know, I quite a few of these books have been quite dark books, but I think particularly something like this, with this book in particular, it's important to read about these things and educate yourself about these things, because we need to open our minds, as this past year has shown us more than ever. We need to approach the world with a questioning gaze, rather than accepting the truths that have been told to us. Or the narratives, should I say, that have been told to us by the mainstream media. So yeah, this really affected me, and Adichie is a writer that I really want to explore more of. Her work, her prose is just so beautiful and poetic, and you feel the hope that Biafra brings to the people of the book, and you feel the tragedy when the hope isn't realised. So yeah, recommended. Recommended. Probably one of the best of the books I read this year, I would say. So you might have seen I've read quite a lot of genre fiction this year. And in terms of science fiction, this is the best book I've read this year. I read it for a book club. I didn't know anything about the book before picking it up. I had heard of the writer before, but didn't know anything about his writing. And I'm talking about Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny. This is the real deal. this is the best science fiction book I've read since Dune, and I don't make that comparison lightly. This book came about right around the same time as Dune, and it's preoccupied with a lot of the same themes in terms of depicting Eastern cultures in a science fiction setting, and its focus on the processes of colonization and ecology are quite similar to the ideas of Dune. But where this steps apart from Dune I kind of feel of a bit more as a space opera. This isn't so much a space opera as it is a science fiction fantasy, and at multiple points in the book it is one or the other or both at the same time. And as I think it shares as much with Dune as it does with something like Lord of the Rings, although much shorter. The book is just as epic and dense, and Zelazny's prose, again, man oh man. There's a scene in this book, there's a fight scene that lasts about 15 pages, and I normally hate reading battle sequences in books. I find a lot of writers can't really describe battles or fighting in books in a compelling way, but I couldn't put this down during that scene. And so much of the rest of the book. The basic concept of the book is that a group of people colonize another planet from Earth. They leave Earth and colonize another planet, and their technology enables them to dominate the planet. And the technology also allows them to take on the godhood, basically, and they take on the identities and the visuals and the kind of cultural paradigms of gods from the Indian religions. And rather than bringing peace to the planet that they colonize, they enslave a lot of the people and enslave their children as well. But each chapter launches forward probably about 100 years, and you see kind of the relationships of the gods to the planet, and the kind of tension comes when I guess you'd call him the main character, although he's not so much a point of view character. A character called Sam, who took on the persona of Buddha, and he basically believes that the gods have been destructive and selfish in keeping technology just for themselves, and he believes that the moral thing, the right thing to do, is to share that technology with the rest of the world and to lift people up out of this hierarchical system that abuses people. So again, there's probably a lot of themes that speak quite a lot to the year of 2020 in this book. Yeah, I couldn't recommend this enough. I couldn't put this down. I was absolutely absorbed, and I'll definitely be reading more Zelazny after reading this book. So if you've not heard of this, absolutely recommend going out of your way to get a copy and read this. It's a really unique book. We're going back to some non-fiction, although I guess this is somewhat less academic and more literary non-fiction. This was another book that I read to kind of educate myself after the first wave of the Black Lives Matter protests. And I'm talking about Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. Coates is a journalist and writer in the United States who writes a lot about race in the United States. And this book takes the form of a extended piece of writing, a letter that he writes to his son, to answer questions that his son has about why race is why these systems are the way that they are in the United States. And a lot of the book and a lot of the emotion of the book comes from Coates talking very directly and personally to his son and kind of recognizing the differences between them. Coates' experience as a black man growing up in Chicago, the south side of Chicago, as a child in the 70s and 80s and 90s is a very different experience to the experience that his son had growing up in New York and visiting Paris, being the son of two somewhat wealthy parents. And their experiences as people of colour are different because of that. Coates had a much harder time of things, and I think a lot of the emotion and tension of the book is in his realising that he has failed to kind of realise that his son has grown up in a different world, a slightly different world. Not necessarily a better world, but perhaps a world with slightly more freedom than he experienced growing up. And yeah, it's just a really beautiful, poetic piece of writing, and the way that he uses his words and the kind of intonations that he brings to the writing is really beautiful. I often found myself quite emotional reading this because he clearly loves his son so much, and that love is what is the line that pulls you through this book. So yeah, I recommend. We're going a little bit lighthearted now. This was one of my favourite books that I've read this year, and I absolutely adore this character now. I have to thank my friend Elisa for introducing me to these books. I read the first book, this is the second book, The Terracotta Dog by Andrea Camilleri, the second book in the Inspector Montalbano mysteries, all set in Sicily, coastal Sicily, and each book is like going on holiday. That might sound quite shallow, but my love for the book is anything other than shallow. Montalbano is such a likeable character, and is set apart so much from other detectives. You know, this is not Philip Marlowe, this is not Sherlock Holmes, this is not a man who is tortured by the job and traumatised by the things he's seen. He's just a man with a lot of compassion, who doesn't suffer fools, who just really enjoys being a detective. He really, he can't live without having these puzzles to solve. And seeing the pleasure that he gets from his life gives you a lot of pleasure reading this. And yeah, it's just the way that Camilleri writes about Sicily, the landscape, the food, the people. It's so vivid, and it really puts you there. And I read the first two books this year, this being the second. This was the best of the two, and I think, to be honest, you don't need to read the first. Just jump into the Terracotta Dog. This is a brilliant book, and if you like crime fiction, this is something a little bit different. I really recommend reading it. And I also, just on a personal note, I love these covers. I think they've started phasing this line of printings out, and they have new cover artwork, which I don't like, because these painted artworks are just summarise the feeling that you get from the book so much. And this is a particularly epic. I mean, the mystery is epic. It's 50 years in the making. The book itself is, you'll read this in 2 days because it's compulsively readable. It's so funny. There's so much humour, and the mystery is compelling. So yeah, I'll be reading a lot more of these next year. In fact, I think I'm going to read the third book, The Snack Thief, as my next read after my current read, which is one of the not so good books I've read this year, which is why it's not appearing on this video. But I'm determined to finish it, because we must finish things as people. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. Montalbano, highly recommended. Romantic in the classic sense of the word. Speaking of romance, that was not a segue that I had intended. The next book that I want to talk about is a book that my dear friend Sartak bought for me for my birthday. And I'm talking about Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak, one of the classics of Russian literature. And according to this copy, one of the greatest love stories ever told, which is really funny to read that on the front cover of this, because the love story only really happens in the last 100 pages. And to reduce the reputation of the book to just being a romance story is a bit of a crime, I think, because the book is so much more than just the romance. The romance is good, don't get me wrong, but the book is so much about Russia as a country and the process of transition between Tsarist Russia and Communist Russia, and the tectonic shifts that had to happen to allow that to happen. It's no wonder that the book was suppressed by the Soviets, because I don't know if I'd call it anti-revolutionary, but it does not cast a good glance on the revolution and the violence that ensued. Pasternak is highly critical of the way the revolution happened, of the sort of minimising of people's minds by the state. it's quite, not to say that Tsarist Russia is necessarily the best place in the world, but, you know, it's a complicated issue, and the book takes you through the complexity of it, with a cast of characters that are highly realised. I think my favourite character in the book was Lara, who is the romantic opposite to Dr. Javago. Yeah, it's a book. It's a book, and Pasternak is obviously somebody who really loves Russia and really loves its people, but feels very sad to have seen the things that the revolution did to Russia. I've since come to learn that the book is slightly autobiographical, so I want to do more research on Pasternak as a person in his life, because I think there's a lot more to this story than what is printed on the paper. So if you feel, it's quite a heavy book, I won't lie, it was tough to get through at points, but I got so much out of it, and if Pasternak has read anything else, I'll be tracking it down, because this is one of the best books I've read this year. Not to be lightly endeavoured, not to be lightly taken on. This is a tough crack, but you'll get a lot out of it. I swear that to you. It's a really profound piece of literature, and it does what literature does best, which is it teaches us, and it expands our horizons and teaches us more about being people, you know. So yeah, recommended. As is all the books in this video, because otherwise why would I be making this video? And this is Jim Bean, by the way. My good old friend Jim. I've become very acquainted with him over the past year. Okay. We're down to our last 4 books now. This is a book that I was supposed to have studied at university, but like a few of my friends know, I didn't actually read it when we came to doing the class on it. I think I read the first 30 pages and it was quite a lot for me to take on at the time. It's a complex book, but I'm so glad, so glad that I took the time to return to it this year and finally finish reading it. This is written by one of my favourite authors, which is why I think I took the time to finish reading it. I'm talking about Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, which I have here in a lovely, beautiful Folio Society copy, illustrated by, come on, The Dispossessed, illustrated by David Lupton. Yeah, this was, if you ever want a book to challenge the way that you see the world, challenge you to think outside of what capitalism has made of the world, this is the book to read. A lot of the book is about a scientist called Zhivago, who grows up on this planet called Anaras, which is a anarcho-syndicalist planet. It's not quite anarchism, but it functions very much independent of any government. There's no government on this planet, and you know, I think a lot, myself included, a lot of people that I've talked to have always been very wary of anarchism, thinking how can a world survive, how can a culture survive in an anarchist way, and you will see in this book how anarchism can be a working solution to a lot of the world's problems. The book has a subtitle of An Ambiguous Utopia. It's important to note that, you know, what we think of as a utopia is going to mean different things to different people, and a utopia depends on what we privilege as the most important thing. Do we depend on access to material goods? Do we want access to entertainment? Do we want freedom? Because these 3 things don't necessarily go hand in hand together. And life on Anaras is really hard. It's really hard, and the people work hard, and they might suffer, but they suffer with freedom. Freedom is what they have at the end of the day, and they have complete free choice on what they do. But that does mean life is hard as a society. And Zhivago is a scientist who has basically reached the limits of this utopia, because he has come up with a new technology, an Ansible, he calls it, which will allow instantaneous communication between planets, which will revolutionize contact between different cultures. And you know, a lot of what makes the utopia of Anaras stable is the fact that they're cut off from the rest of the world, of the galaxy. They don't have communication with the rest of the planets. So he goes to a planet called Eurus, which is capitalism at its most extraordinary and repulsive. And he kind of begins to exist in a different way of existing in this planet, and he starts to question not just how capitalism functions, because a lot of what we take for granted actually doesn't make that much sense when you think about it. You know, systemic inequality, sexism, racism, you know, these are devils that we have to exercise as a society, and a lot of those devils are encouraged by the processes of capitalism. The processes of capitalism. That was my Cafefe moment. Oh God, if only. But yeah, it's a really insightful book, and it's a really beautiful book, and particularly the scenes where he remembers or talks about his wife are really beautiful. The depth of his love that he has for her really touched me. So if you're looking for a read that's going to give you hope in a hopeless time, much like I always think this is a very hopeful glance up, The Dispossessed might be the read that you're looking for. It's not the happiest read, but it might be the most hopeful read that I've read this year, because it recognises a lot of the cruelty that we do to each other and tries to find a new way of existing as people. And we need imaginations like Le Guin right now, when the world seems so troubled and besought on all sides by the issues of our time. And there's so much suffering. We need writers who can imagine a different way of living, alternative ways of living. So this was a profound book, and it had a profound effect on me and the way that I thought about life and my life this year. It gave me a lot of hope where maybe I felt nothing but despair before. So yeah, but I highly recommend this book. Now, talking of despair, my third last book that I'm discussing in this video is a horror classic which I read in October, wanting a spooky read for the season, and I got that in spades. I didn't sleep for about a week when I was reading this. I had nightmares every night. I'm talking about The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty, again in a lovely folio edition. This is now out of print, so if you want to get this, you'll have to get it secondhand. But this is, I'd seen the film a few times, and I was always scared by the film, and always liked the film, but this book takes it in a completely, not different direction, because the film is quite faithful to the book. The film was written by William Peter Blatty, but the book just goes places that the film can't, because you have to be, what you show on the film can't cross a certain line, you know, and the book dances on that line in terms of what is taboo, and it really is a nightmarish read in a way that the film just can't be. This edition was beautifully illustrated with photographs by Jeremy Caniglia, and they really added so much to the atmosphere of the text and my impression of the book. I think the thing that makes this book so nightmarish is that it's able to go inside the minds of the characters in a way that the film just can't, by virtue of the process of storytelling. Yeah, it was a really really scary read. Really terrified me. I rewatched the film shortly after, and the film just cannot stand up to the book. And it made me sad that the film is seen as the definitive version of the story when it's clearly the book. The book is so much better than the film. It's crazy. So make some time and read this. If you are a horror fan, absolutely seek this out. It reminded me of the better works of Stephen King in some ways, although perhaps more literary than Stephen King in Blatty's approach to the writing process. I'd also say this is one of the best books about religion that I've read in a very long time, in terms of what it is to be Catholic. It really... Blatty was obviously a Catholic himself. Only a Catholic could have written a book like this about Catholicism. It asks some very important questions about theology. and really, again, makes you think as well as scaring the utter shit out of you. So yeah, The Exorcist was one of my favourite books I read this year. Next up, this is not actually my copy. This is a library copy from the library that I run. One of the good things about being a librarian is taking books from my library and taking them home and reading them for free. But this is Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Saadawi. I apologise if I've pronounced that wrong. It's set in Baghdad just after 9/11, during the American occupation of Baghdad and Iraq, and it basically is a recycling of the Frankenstein mythology, but used to comment on the war on terror, as the Americans called it. This is not written from an American point of view. This was written in Arabic from an Iraqi point of view, and it's absolutely phenomenal. Combining gothic terror and surrealist humour and war novel all into one, and journal. It's just so many different kinds of books live within this book, much like Frankenstein. The story follows a man called Heaney, who is a rubble dealer, a junk dealer, and he basically collects parts of bodies, human bodies, from bombings all over Baghdad, and his plan is to stitch them into a body to submit to the authorities to bury, to force them to recognise the human cost of this war. And then he goes home one day and the corpse isn't there anymore, and murders start happening across Baghdad. It's a really incredible political reimagining of Mary Shelley's novel, and it does things very differently from the novel. If you've read Frankenstein and think you don't need to read this because you know the story already, you do not know this story. This is a phenomenal novel, and you know, the New Statesman says on the back that it is a darkly delightful novel, and I think that sums it up really well. It's a very enjoyable book, very easy to read. It was fantastic, and it made me think I need to read more Iraqi fiction in the coming year, because I really, really enjoyed this book and would like to read some more. Okay, and our last book is one that I've been wanting to read for many years. Not so much a book as a piece of epic poetry. I feel ashamed that I never read this at university, but I'm talking about Beowulf, as translated by Seamus Heaney. I mean, again, sort of like Lord of the Rings, I feel like, what can I say about this that hasn't already been said? But I guess that's not the point. I think I read this out of a sense of obligation and duty as somebody who studies English literature and loves English literature. I felt a need to read this. What I didn't expect was that this is compulsively readable and so entertaining and so enjoyable. I mean, I read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight when I was at university, and I really enjoyed it. But it is a writing of its time, and it is not necessarily the most entertaining of reads. It's beautiful, but it's not necessarily entertaining. Beowulf, on the other hand, is fucking really disgusting and violent and gross, and the action is incredible, and the scares are real. And I mean, there was this one bit which I'll read out from the introduction, because it kind of summed up about why the book is so important to read these days. So this first bit is from Seamus Heaney, and the later bit is a quote from the poem. At these moments of lyric intensity, the keel of the poetry is deeply set in the element of sensation, while the mind's lookout sways metrically and far-sightedly in the elements of pure comprehension, which is to say that the elevation of Beowulf is always paradoxically, buoyantly down to earth. And nowhere is this more obvious and memorably the case than in the account of the hero's funeral with which the poem ends. Here the inexorable and the elegiac combine in a description of the funeral pyre being got ready, the body being burnt and the barrow being constructed, a scene at once immemorial and oddly contemporary. The Geat woman who cries out in dread as the flames consume the body of her dead lord could come straight from a late 20th century news report from Rwanda or Kosovo. Her keen is a nightmare glimpse into the minds of people who have survived traumatic, even monstrous events, and who are now being exposed to a comfortless future. We immediately recognise her predicament and the pitch of her grief, and find ourselves the better for having them expressed with such adequacy, dignity, and unforgiving truth. On a height they kindled the hugest of all funeral fires. Fumes of wood smoke billowed darkly up. The blaze roared and drowned out their weeping. Winds died down and flames wrought havoc in the hot bone house, burning it to the core. They were disconsolate and wailed aloud for the lords to cease. A Geat woman too sung out in grief. With hair bound up, she unburdened herself of her worst fears, a wild litany of nightmare and lament. Her nation invaded, enemies on the rampage, bodies in piles, slavery and abasement. Heaven swallowed the smoke. This is an incredible piece of writing, and just because you might be a bit wary about reading something so old, it's not the most modern thing. I can't recommend enough that you try this out. It was compulsively readable and just so entertaining and enjoyable. And it really did feel like a eulogy for a passing time, a passing era. So, yeah, check it out. Well, that's my 15 best books of the year. I think I'm going to make another few videos soon. I'll be going through my favourite graphic novels and some of the best films I've seen this year as well. So do come back when those videos are up, and I hope that you're all safe and with your loved ones, and, you know, getting into the holiday spirit even during this time. Thank you everybody for watching.